Hi class, this is your instructor, Skylar Huff, and welcome to Chapter 54, Community Ecology. So in the 53rd chapter, we examine the dynamics of populations, and it's in the natural world. So most populations are part of a community, which consists of an association or assemblage of populations of different species. These populations and species live and interact indirectly and directly with each other in the same place at the same time. So, of course, that definition for community is deliberately broad because it refers to the ecological categories that can vary greatly in size, they lack precise boundaries, and are rarely completely isolated. Small communities nest within larger communities, and as I get to this, just keep in mind that a mangrove forest is a community, but so are the interlacing roots that support each tree, as you all see here pictured. So mangrove roots, anchored in sediment made up of sand and peat, are breeding grounds for nurseries for crabs, shrimp, and many commercially important fish. So it includes blue crabs, lizards, and turtles that feed on the insects, algae, and dead animal material. Small mammals scurry along the roots, and manatees and alligators find shelter from the tropical sun. So the mangrove root surfaces are home to invertebrates, algae, bacteria, archaea, and fungi, which provide nutrients for other organisms. Mangroves also filter excess nutrients and some toxic pollutants from the water. So organisms exist in an abiotic environment that is essential to their lives and their interactions with one another. Minerals, air, water, and sunlight are just as much a part of a bat's environment, for example, as the flowers it pollinates depends on the nectar. It depends on, for nectar and insects. So a biological community and its abiotic environment together compose an ecosystem. So like communities, ecosystems are broad entities that refer to ecological units of various sizes. So here in this chapter, we will focus on those living communities, and we'll explore some challenges, or some of the challenges, in understanding common patterns and processes that govern communities. So the abiotic components of ecosystems, including energy flow and trophic structure, and of course, nutrient cycling and climate are considered in the 55th chapter. So now let's get to community structure and functioning. So communities exhibit characteristic properties that populations lack. These properties are known collectively as community structure and functioning, and that includes the number and types of species present, the relative abundance of each species, the interactions among different species, and community resilience to disturbances. And of course, with that includes energy and nutrient flow throughout the community and productivity. So here we call community ecology is just that describing and analyzing the patterns and processes within a community. So keep this in mind because it includes everything that occurs within which. So common patterns and processes in a community, they are things such as the pond community, a pine forest community, and even a human gut community. So this all helps ecologists understand the community structure and functioning. So with that, communities are exceedingly difficult to study because the large number of individuals and many different species interact with one another and are interdependent in a variety of ways. Species compete with one another for food, water, living space, and even other resources. So just keep these in mind because it's those interactions within that community. So some species form intimate complex associations with one another, whereas other species seem only remotely connected. So certain species interact in positive ways in a process known as facilitation, which modifies and enhances the local community for other species. For example, alpine plants in the harsh environments grow faster and larger and reproduce more successfully when certain other plants are growing nearby. So in your textbook, see page 1172 to show you all this. So here, class, this is figure 54.1b. And here you all see the field mouse and ear chickweed. So it's field mouse, ear chickweed plants that are planted and grown within and outside clumps of Laricia. So in red, you see, of course, the field mouse chickweed, and in blue, you see the clumps. So as you all can see here, that there is a decrease, class, a great decrease when, of course, they're grown outside those clumps, as opposed to within the clumps. And I'm changing my color. So within clumps is here. Outside of those clumps is there. Here in 54.1c, we're looking at alpine barley plants. And of course, they were planted and grown within and outside the clumps of Laricia. So of course, again, this is within those clumps. This is, class, outside of those clumps. So this is definitely, class, a great example of facilitation. So just keep in mind that organisms, class, in what they do, they also play one of three main roles in the community, being, of course, that producer, consumer, or decomposer. So within which, class, it's the communities that interact and have those complex, and often those interactions are not readily apparent. So populations of a community, as they interact with and affect one another, those ways may not be easily seen, class, such as the connection between acorn production, the white-footed mouse, the deer, and the gypsy moth production. For instance, when there is a bumper crop of acorns, class, it may also, of course, have the deer drawn more so to the forest because, of course, that bumper crop of acorns, then, of course, increasing in tick population and increasing, of course, the incidence, class, of our exposure, meaning human exposure, to Lyme bacterium, causing Lyme disease, of course, creating a public health hazard. By that same token, class, it would increase, of course, that white-footed moth population, which would affect, class, the gypsy moth by, of course, decreasing the gypsy moth pupae population and, of course, providing healthier trees in that forest. So those interactions, class, are things that are looked at and may be taken into account. Well, I'm sorry, must be taken into account. So here we get to, of course, the niche and habitat. So the niche is simply, class, an animal's ecological role within the structure and function of community. And every species is thought to have its own ecological role within the structure and function of the community. So this was put forth, class, by Hutchinson. And, of course, any ecological niche takes into account all biotic and abiotic aspects of a species' existence. And, of course, that is all physical, chemical, and biological factors that the species needs to survive, remain healthy, and reproduce. So with that being the case, the niche includes that local environment in which a species lives, i.e. its habitat. So let's keep in mind those factors. So here, class, we're getting to contrasting two things, what is known as that fundamental niche and that realized niche. So the potential ecological niche of a species is known as that fundamental niche, i.e. the fundamental niche, class, would be everywhere that species could very well exist. I say everywhere. And kind of think of this as the state of Alabama. So if you were to look at a map of the state of Alabama, I would say you could find that white-tailed deer, class, throughout the state of Alabama, including every inch, every square mile. However, class, when you get to, of course, the realized niche, it would only include, class, the actual place or places in which that white-tailed deer has been found. Looking closely here, class, we're looking at, of course, the niche or that dimensional habitat for the green anole lizard. So here in what is called figure 54.3a, of course, the green anole, class, is the anole species and the only anole species native to North America. So with that being the case, in figure 54.3b, you're looking at the brown anole. This was introduced to Florida. So it is native, class, to Cuba and the Bahamas. So if you look even closer, class, in figure 54.3c, you can see, class, that positions of the two species along that, of course, single niche dimension. Species 1, class, is, of course, the green anole, and species 2 is the brown anole. So it's shown here, class, that the fundamental niches of the two species most definitely overlaps right there. And of course, in figure 54.3, D as in dog, the brown anole outcompetes the green anole in the area where the niches overlap, restricting the niche of the green anole, which you all can now see there. So it's most important, class, to know that fundamental as well as that realized niche of these species. And not just these two, I mean all species. So now to limiting resources. So a species' structural, physical, and behavioral adaptations determines its tolerance for environmental extremes. So if the species can, and of course, outside those bounds, of course, of its tolerance, the species cannot live there. And of course, that would be expected, meaning you would not expect to see a cactus living in a pond. And of course, you would not expect water lilies to be, of course, living in a desert. So any environmental resource that is scarce or unfavorable tends to restrict the ecological niche of a species, and that, of course, is what is known as a limiting resource. For instance, most of the limiting resources have been studied are simple variables such as the soil's mineral content, the temperature extremes, and precipitation amounts. So such investigations have disclosed that any factor either exceeding the tolerance of a species or the present quantities and smaller than the required minimum limits the presence of that species in a community. So it's the very same class. You could use temperatures, meaning minimum temperature and maximum temperature, and using just those two numbers, the minimum and maximum temperatures, and you can use those class for predicting, of course, species. You can predict, of course, whether or not that species can live, can tolerate in that area. And that gets right into, of course, modeling class, to modeling, of course, species distributions. Excuse me. So in another example class, the biotic and abiotic factors influences a species niche. So Connell investigated such class, looking at the biotic and abiotic factors that affect the distribution of two barnacle species in the rocky intertidal zone of Scotland. So the intertidal zone is a challenging environment, and organisms in the intertidal zone must be able to tolerate exposure to the drying air during low tides. So barnacles are sessile crustaceans whose bodies are covered by a shell of calcium carbonate. So when the shell is open, their feathery appendages extend to filter the water from the food. So as you can see here, class, you have the Chimanthomus and, of course, the Semibalbanus species. So one is kind of in a, I guess you say, tan color, and the other of which class is in this brown color. So what you can see, class, in A through C, this is coming from figure 54.4 on page 1175. So in figure 54.4a, the species of barnacles class belong to those two genera that grow in this intertidal zone. So now, class, to figure 54.4b. So when the Chimanthomus species intertidals were experimentally removed, the Semibalbanus species, those individuals did not expand into their section of the rock. Now in C, class, 54.4c, when the Semibalbanus individuals were experimentally removed, the Chimanthomus species individuals, they spread into the empty area. So what you all can see here is that with that competition class among barnacle species for that limiting resource of living space was that one of the processes that Connell research demonstrated that we now examine other aspects of various ecologists have determined in both laboratory and field studies. So, of course, that meant, class, for those two species that compete for space, the Semibalbanus species, which is larger and grows faster, it outcompetes the smaller class Commensalism species of barnacles. All right, so let's get to competition yet again. We've, of course, learned about competition once before. Well, now we'll learn about it yet again. So competition class can be either intraspecific or interspecific. So to not, of course, review these again, I'll say make sure you all have a firm grasp of how it occurs between two or more individuals which attempt to use that same essential resource, such as food, water, shelter, or even living space or sunlight. And it's all, of course, because resources are often in limited supply in the environment. And of course, they're used by one individual, decreases the amount available to others. So just keep that in mind, class, and make sure you have a firm grasp, of course, of the two types of competition, being intraspecific competition. Of course, that would be class within a population, i.e. one species, or between different species class in the case of interspecific competition. So here, class, let's get through a few more ecological interactions, class, among species. So here, class, we're at competitive exclusion. Make sure you all can describe this on your test. So with competitive exclusion, class, this, of course, is being shown here, and it was shown, class, in the past with Gauss. You can see this, class, on page 1177. So the struggle for existence. So Gauss postulated, class, that no two species can indefinitely occupy the same niche in a community. And as he got to this, it was, class, that he used Paramecium species. So, of course, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum alone. And, of course, alone, each of these species reach what is called, I say, carrying capacity, meaning they have that quick, what is called exponential growth, and then leveling out, class. Each of these alone did. And, of course, just keep in mind that, of course, with this process, class, they show that when in mixture, it was Paramecium aurelia, class, that outcompeted Paramecium caudatum in mixture. So they, of course, competed, class, and you see this point here at maybe about a day and a half, and then ultimately, class, they competed, of course, to exclusion. So just keep in mind that this process, class, as it's shown, is competitive competition as it happens there. So now to resource partitioning. So at resource partitioning, class, it's thus, of course, that allows that over natural selection is to favor, class, individuals of each species that avoid or reduce competition for environmental resources. So that's reduce, or at least the reduction in competition among coexisting species as a result of each species' niche differing from the others in one or more ways is that resource partitioning, meaning that resource partitioning, class, could include the time of feeding. It could include also the location of feeding, even nest sites and other aspects of the species' ecological niche. So this resource partitioning, class, is why these species are there and able to live together. So with this, class, although it was shown, class, by MacArthur that he found individuals of each species spend most of their time feeding at different portions of those species in the forest, as we see here, class, with the warbler species. So we have the yellow rumped warbler here, the black-throated green warbler there, the Blackburnian warbler was here, class, the bay-breasted warbler was there, and then the Cape May warbler there. This is a perfect example, class, by MacArthur Bills, found to, of course, show you all resource partitioning. So let's get now down to predation and coevolution. So natural selection shapes the bodies and behaviors of both predator and prey. So predation, class, is that consumption of one species, of course, that prey, by another, class, being that predator. So I can't make it any more blunt than that, but predation includes animals, class, eating other animals, as well as animals eating plants, called herbivory, and then with this, class, predation has resulted in evolutionary arms race with the evolution of predator strategies to be more efficient ways to capture prey, and prey strategies to be, of course, developing better ways to escape the predator. So a predator that is more efficient at catching prey exerts more selective force, class, on its prey. And over time, those adaptations that reduce the probability of being captured may evolve in the prey species, and in turn, these adaptations exert a strong selective force on the predator. So this, class, meaning that interdependent evolution of two interacting species known as coevolution, i.e., each of which, class, evolving together. So resulting of which new traits arise randomly in a population as a result of those genetic changes. So they may be, of course, beneficial. They, of course, could be harmful. And then again, class, it just may very well be no effect. So, of course, predator strategies. So here, of course, I get to pursuit. So with pursuit, class, meaning it's just that any trait that increases hunting efficiency, such as the speed of brown pelicans or the intelligence, or even, class, the cooperative behavior of orcas, favors predators that their pursuit of their prey. So because these carnivores must process information quickly during the pursuit of prey, their brains are generally larger relative to body size than those of the prey that they pursue. So with this, ambush class is another effective way to catch prey. So the yellow crab spider is the same color white as the yellow flower on which it hides. So this camouflage keeps the unwary insects of that visit of the flower for nectar from noticing the spider until it's too late. It fools the birds of prey and, of course, on that crab spider. So this class allows those adaptations to aid in class getting the prey. Ambush strategies. Now on to plant defenses. So chemical protection is an effective plant defense against herbivory. So plants cannot escape predators because, of course, they have several physical and chemical adaptations that protect them from being eaten. So the presence of spines, thorns, or even tough leathery leaves, or even classic waxen leaves, discourages foraging behaviors from grazing. Other plants produce an array of protective chemicals that are unpalatable or even toxic to herbivores. So the active ingredients in plants such as marijuana and tobacco affect hormone activity and nerve, muscle, and liver and kidney functioning, and that may discourage foraging by herbivores. So interestingly enough, milkweeds are an excellent example of biochemical evolution between plants and herbivores. So milkweeds produce alkaloids and cardiac glycosides, and of course chemicals that are poisonous to all animals except one group of insects. So the ability to either tolerate or metabolize the milkweed toxin has evolved in these insects. So the insect class can eat the milkweed and avoid competition from other herbivores. So insects, because few others tolerate the milkweed toxins, so the predators also learn to avoid these insects, which accumulate the toxins in their tissues and therefore become toxic. So the black, white, and yellow colorization of the monarch caterpillar, shown here, class, on the milkweed feeder, so clearly announces its toxicity to predators that have learned to associate those bright colors with illness. So conspicuous colors and patterns which advertise a species' unpalatability to potential predators are known as aposematic coloration or warning coloration. And class, if you cannot say, please plant a milkweed. The milkweeds class are amazingly, of course, perfect. And I say that because the monarch butterflies need them. And they definitely, class, have to have those. So other animal defenses, class, here, such as the predator defenses, being that they can have behavior defenses, mechanical defenses, or even chemical defenses. And some animals, class, have cryptic coloration or body forms that help them hide, such as, class, what you all see here with the mossy leaf-tailed gecko. So as it hunts for insects at night and sleeps pressed against a tree branch by day, it is virtually invisible when it sleeps. So there you have it, class. So up next, class, we have what is known as mimicry. So sometimes in mimicry, and to ensure you can get what I'm getting to here, a defenseless species, being that mimic is protected from predation by its resemblance to a species that is dangerous in some way. So a strategy class is known as Batesian mimicry. So many examples of this phenomenon exists. For example, the harmless scarlet king snake looks much like a venomous coral snake that predators may avoid it too. So as you see here, class, in figure 5411A, that is that scarlet king snake. In figure 5411B, that is that eastern coral snake. So interestingly, the range of the scarlet king snake extends far beyond that of the coral snake, in an area where the coral snakes do not occur. Having the coloration of the model confers no special advantage to the king snake and may be harmful, triggering natural selection. This seems to be the case, and scientists have reported that the scarlet king snake populations located far from coral snakes have undergone natural selection, class, and look less like the model. So let's get to Mullerian mimicry. So here we have two or more different species, co-models, all of which are poisonous or harmful or distasteful, and they come to resemble one another, class, during the course of evolution. So their similarity in appearance works as an adaptive advantage because potential predators are more easily learn a single common aposematic coloration. So scientists hypothesize that the visceroid and monarch butterflies are an example of Mullerian mimicry. So of course, you have that class being shown for you all in your text, I do believe. You know what? They have changed up our textbook class. They no longer show that. I have to find a photo for you all. But there you have it. So up next class, we get to symbiosis. So symbiosis involves close associations between species. So this is just any intimate relationship or association between members of two or more species. And it's typical for symbiosis to involve one species living on or in other species. So here, class, the symbionts, the partners of a symbiotic relationship, may benefit from or be affected by or be harmed by the relationship. So symbiosis occurs, class, across all domains and kingdoms of life, and most of the millions of symbiotic associations are products of coevolution. So symbiosis occurs, class, in three forms, known as mutualism, commensalism, class, and parasitism. And I'll just go ahead and state, class, that commensalism does not typically occur. And I say it does not typically occur because, well, it's not one that happens to provide anything to either species. So now I get to mutualism, class. And in mutualism, this is a symbiotic relationship, class, in which both partner benefits. So, of course, the benefits are shared. So it is either, class, obligate, meaning essential for the survival of both species, or facultative, meaning that either partner can live alone under certain conditions. So one case, class, being, of course, being between the nitrogen-fixing bacteria of the genus Rhizobium and legumes, being the plants such as peas, beans, and clover. So the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which live inside the root nodules of legumes, supply the plants with most of the nitrogen they require to manufacture such nitrogen-containing compounds as chlorophylls, proteins, and nucleic acids. So those legumes supply the sugars and other energy-rich organic compounds to their bacterial symbionts. So with that, another example class could be the mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizae are the mutualistic associations between fungi and the roots of plants. These associations, class, are quite common, and they think that they're a part of, class, 90% of all plant species have mycorrhizae. So the fungus, which grows around and into the roots, as well as into the surrounding soil, absorb the essential minerals, especially, class, phosphorus. So with that being the case, class, that phosphorus from the soil provides them to the plant, and in return, the plant provides that fungus, that arbuscular fungi, the organic molecules produced by way of photosynthesis. So plants can then, class, grow more vigorous in the presence of mycorrhizal fungi, and they better tolerate environmental stressors such as drought and high soil temperatures. Quite, class, the case. And even in us, class, in humans, we have bacteria within us, class. The term microbiome refers to the community of microorganisms, including, class, their genomes and interactions. So the term human microbiota refers to the community of microorganisms that inhabit the human body. So we must have, class, the human intestinal microbiota, which includes, of course, the bacteria that receive shelter and nutrients from the exchange for breaking down complex carbohydrates and producing vitamins. We must, I repeat, we must have these, class, within our body. In addition, class, the human intestinal microbiota ferment unused materials, preventing, class, colonization of pathogenic bacteria, and strengthen our immune systems. So getting back to commensalism, class, yes, it doesn't necessarily occur much, but of course, in this case, it's showing the Spanish moss that attaches to tree branches. And keep in mind, class, that Spanish moss is not moss at all. It's actually, class, a member of the bromeliad family. And you say bromeliad family? Yes, I did. And I say the bromeliad family because they are epiphytes in that class. These are plants that grow on other plants. And just keep in mind, class, that this is not at all, class. I repeat, as not at all a moss. It's an epiphytic plant that grows on another plant. So next up, class, parasitism. So with parasitism, class, the case here is that the parasite, of course, would be that one that benefits, class, whereas the other, being the host, is adversely affected. So the parasite obtains nourishment from its host and a parasite rarely kills its host directly, but may weaken it, class, rendering it more vulnerable to predators, competitors, or abiotic stressors. And when a parasite causes disease, and sometimes the death of a host, it is called a pathogen. A pathogen. And of course, there could be two types of parasites, those that are ectoparasites, being outside the host's body, and of course, those endoparasites, which are found class inside the host's body. So next up, class, the keystone species. The keystone species is imperative to determining class the nature of the entire community. And with a keystone species, it's not class, meaning typically too abundant, but it has enormous or disproportionate effects class on that community. So their impact is greatly disproportionate class compared to the abundance of them, because they are crucial in determining class the species composition and the ecosystem functioning of that community. One example class is going to be a predatory sea star species, Pisaster class Orechius, and as it was a removed class from a rocky intertidal community class, what happened thereafter was that about half of those 15 species disappeared class from the community because they were crowded out by mussels and barnacles that had once class been, of course, kept at bay. So they were free class from predation. Keystone species class have a major importance. Even class the hunting of wolves to extinction will result in class in communities with widely considerable less biological diversity. So we must class have our keystone species. So of course it's amazingly well class to have wolves. Dominant species class for, I say, a good contrast in that dominant species, of course, greatly affect the community, but it's because they are just quite common in that area. So trees in the forest, or corals in coral reefs, or even class cattle that overgraze the range lands. Their, of course, effects are dominant, or at least as such, because it's just that many of them. So with top-down processes and bottom-up processes. So with bottom-up processes, class, these are, of course, based upon those resources such as water or soil minerals that control the number of producers. Notice it's bottom-up. So it begins, class, at the bottom as the energy flow class goes through which. So top-down processes, they regulate ecosystem function by trophic interactions from the highest trophic levels, such as the carnivores that eat herbivores, which of course eventually eat producers. So they do contrast class quite well, regulating ecosystem function by those trophic interactions at the top. So there you have it. Bottom-up processes versus those top-down processes, which of course begin their class with those carnivores. So next we get to community biodiversity. So prepare yourself to describe all of this in your test. So with community biodiversity, keep in mind that species diversity speaks to a measure of both the number of species in the community and the relative abundance of each of those species. So species richness class is nothing more than the number of species in a community, determined by counting the differing species, and then species evenness class is at the relative abundance of each of those species. So species diversity class, species richness, and species evenness vary greatly from one community to another and are influenced by the many biotic and abiotic factors. So just keep in mind what diversity is and how it affects communities. So at your own class, determine richness here as well as evenness. And I would say the same here. So species richness class is influenced by the structural complexity of habitats, geographic isolation, and the distance effect. Habitat stress, latitudinal gradients, closeness of the margins of adjacent communities because of the edge effect, and even the dominance of one species over others. And geologic disturbances class also affect evenness and species diversity. So you can see here, class, the number of bird species is, of course, I would say, explained by structural complexity. So you have your response versus your predictor. So yes, structural complexity can, of course, predict the number of bird species. And here, class, you can see that the distance from New Guinea class and the percentage class of species inhabiting different islands on this logarithmic scale class. And here, class, you can see that latitudinal gradient class, of course, showing species richness here, compared class to those in those over the latitudes. Keep in mind each of these key points, class, and make sure you know what these, or at least the effect each of these have on the community. So the ability of a community class to withstand disturbances, i.e. community stability, is related to species richness. Make sure you know this for your test, i.e. the greater number of species in a community is, of course, is less important than any single species should be. So it gives you, class, that resilience, meaning this is my class. I would say communities are more or less resilient, and it's all, class, based on richness. So richness, class, may very well promote stability. So, of course, we're getting now, class, to community development. So as the community develops gradually through a series of steps, of course, is dominated each by different species. So this is getting into what is known as succession. And that, class, is that process, meaning, I repeat, succession is that process of community development over time in which species in one stage are replaced by, of course, different species. So to get to community development and succession, class, there are two types. They are primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession, classes change the species composition over time, and of course the habitat that was not previously, of course, inhabited by organisms. So primary succession, class, occurs before there is any soil, meaning usually there's barren rock that's there, and even classed by those retreating glaciers found in Glacier Bay in Alaska. So remember, class, no soil exists. So this is when you have barren rock, such as after you have a volcanic eruption and everything is gone, and there's nothing there. With secondary succession, however, this occurs typically after some disturbance. So the change in species composition, class, that takes place is after the disturbance has removed the existing vegetation. So with secondary succession, class, soil does exist. So you find this, class, happening either by disturbance by a human, or even, class, in the case of some, I guess you say, storm, such as a hurricane or even tornadic activity. So this, class, leads us directly into, of course, mature communities, which have been their, class, for a long time, but directly into, class, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So as I get to this, class, this was postulated by Connell. You'll explain this in your test. That, of course, species richness, class, is highest at intermediate levels of disturbance. So when there is not much disturbance at all, class, species richness is also low. When there is high disturbance or too much disturbance, I say again, richness is also low. However, class, at intermediate levels of disturbance, class, you find, of course, richness at its highest. And as this is, class, it's just the tropical rainforests that Connell used with this. So when disturbances are not frequent or too intense, of course, you have those species that are better adapted in the earlier stages of succession. And of course, with low levels of disturbance, allowing the late successional species to dominate. And of course, with too much and too least disturbance. So with this, that intermediate level of disturbance, class, is what, of course, promotes those diverse communities. So you will explain this process on your test, class, in that if you have too little or too much disturbance, class, richness is often lower, as opposed to, class, right there in that center with that intermediate level of disturbance. So this has been your instructor, Skylar Huff, and this has been, of course, the chapter called the 54th class, Community Ecology. Please, class, study very well, and thank you all for listening.